I thought I would talk a little bit about how I came to write a book called The Obituary Writer. I gave a talk on Cape Cod a few years ago now, and at the end of the talk, this very, very ancient woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, honey, you've had a terrible life." And I said, "No, I'm a happy person." She said, "No, you're not. You're not a happy person. No, your life is awful." And I said, "No, my life's okay. I'm happy." She said, "No, I don't want you to write about this stuff anymore. Now, what's your next book?" And I said, "The Obituary Writer." And she said, "You're hopeless." And she walked away. But the reason I wrote a book called The Obituary Writer is because a few years ago I went to a dinner party, and let's just say some people who will not be named drank a lot of wine at that party. And that same person, okay, it's me, was seated next to this very charming guy named Stephen. And we just really yacked it up all night. We just had this great conversation. He was very interesting. He had lived in the Middle East, and he had really fallen in love with Arabic literature and poetry. And he knew so much about it, and I know nothing about this. And it was just one of those conversations where you connect in this really wonderful, drunken way. And at one point, he leaned over and kind of slapped my knee, and he said, "I didn't want to say this up front, but I'm a huge fan of yours." And I said, "Oh, thank you." And he said, "And you're so funny. And I just want to ask you, I know this is totally weird, but when I die, will you write my obituary?" And I said, "Of course I will," because he looked pretty healthy. So when he died a week later, suddenly, and I got the call, "You promised you'd write his obituary," I went into a total panic, because it's one thing to say, sure, when you think that's never going to happen, and another thing to actually take on this huge responsibility. Huge. Now, it is true that I am a huge fan of reading obituaries, and I know you all are too, because we love to do that, right? And in particular, I like the ones in the New York Times because they don't hold back. You hear about their depression, you hear about their treatment, they tell it all to you, so there's no questions left unanswered. But they used to have a writer named Robert McGee Thomas, and his obituaries elevated the form. And in fact, there is a book of his collected obituaries called 52 McGees. And so if you are like me and you love obituaries, you must immediately buy that book, well, after the talk. So I do love them. The thing Robert McGee Thomas did was he found an ordinary person and somehow in the obituary made their lives extraordinary. And I thought, isn't that what we all ultimately want? We're all just kind of ordinary unless we've won the Nobel Prize or, we're voted Pope today or, something. We're all pretty ordinary. And how about our obituaries not just being resumes, but actually telling about our extraordinary lives, And I had that in mind, so I called Stephen's family and, friends, and they're all incredibly bereft because he died suddenly. And I would say the same thing at each call, "Tell me about Stephen." And without exception, they said, well, he graduated from college in 19 whatever, or he lived in the Middle East in these years, or, he was born on this day in this city. And I dutifully wrote it all down, and after I talked to everybody, basically I had his resume. And I thought, this won't do. I sat next to this charming, funny, smart, interesting guy, and I won't, he's given me this task, which, I can't even sleep at night because I cannot believe I have to write someone's obituary, but I'm going to make sure I honor him. And so I called everyone back, but I simply said the same thing. "Hi, it's Ann Hood again. Could you tell me about Stephen?" And the second time they told me these amazing stories. Suddenly, the notes I was taking were not unlike the notes I make when I'm writing a novel for characters. He was becoming this fully formed person on paper. And so I was very proud of the obituary. I ended up writing, it was almost like a little short story. And in that moment, I thought, I'm going to write a character, create a character who this is what she does. She honors people in the way she writes their obituaries. So what do you do with that? You have this idea for a character, but that's not a novel. That's just one person in a novel. I often think that my brain is like that thing in your dryer that collects the lint. Because, I go through the world like the rest of us, and, I read things and I talk to people and I think my thoughts. And I'm always really fascinated by what has stuck in that lint trapper up there. And so this book is an example, as I think all my novels are, of the stuff caught in that lint trapper, because here I had my obituary writer. And for some reason, and that I can't explain, I knew that she was not contemporary. You know, I don't usually write historical fiction, so I can't explain why, but I knew this was not someone today. But that's all I had. Obituary writer from another era, didn't know which era. So around the same time, here goes the lint coming, the anniversary of my young daughter's death came. And as many of you know who have read my books, that my daughter Grace died in 2002 very suddenly from a virulent form of strep. And every day on that anniversary, I wake up in not such a great mood. You know, it's just, you're sad. You know, you try not to have dates. It's funny, it's the same theme in a way. Try not to have dates take over your life, but on that day in particular, I always kind of have a pit in my stomach. You know, you remember the day. And so I went to my computer, as I do every morning, and the first thing I read is the Writer's Almanac. And I don't know if any of you read that, but it's by Garrison Keillor. And what he does is he finds a poem and historical information and literary information that occurred on that day. And, you know, it's great stuff. You know, you find out that, like, two people that are so kind of different were born on the same day, and he quotes books, and as I said, always a wonderful poem. So I clicked on the Writer's Almanac, and as it was loading on the computer, I thought, oh, Garrison, I'm having a terrible day. Give me something here, you know, help my spirits, like, you know, give me a great poem. That's what I was thinking. Garrison Keillor will deliver the poem I need to get through today. But instead, hello. But instead, what came up, there was the poem, but what came up was that was the anniversary of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And it really stopped me cold. I thought, earthquakes. Here goes the lint thing. Earthquakes. You know, we all have our private earthquakes. We all have those things that shake our foundation that the rest of the world doesn't even notice, right? And I certainly had mine that day, and what a coincidence that it's the same day as an earthquake that really shook the world. You know, so many people were affected by it. And in that moment, I knew that my obituary writer had survived that San Francisco earthquake. And I think this is how writers' minds, and I know there's writers in the audience, I think this is how writers' minds work, you know. These things collide in just a way that makes sense to you, even though there's no story yet. Well, I came up with a story. I had my character, the obituary writer, and what I had decided was that her lover was lost in that earthquake, but she believes that he survived and has amnesia. And she actually gives up her youth trying to find him. So I have a story, but there was something missing. And seriously, with that description I just said, if someone told me, I would think, you got a novel. That sounds pretty great. She's going to go looking for this guy. But something was missing. And again, it's that piece of being a writer that you can't really explain. But it was certainly there that I knew it was not yet a novel. And so I kind of thought about it, let the lint collect, but didn't write a word. And then so 9 months later came Obama's first inauguration. And I was teaching in Florida, and what they did was brought all of the writers' conference in, plus any students there taking like the winter session or whatever, and they showed it on a big screen in the auditorium. And I was watching it, and I was looking at the faces in the audience with us, and I was looking at the people at the inauguration that they were showing, and I was like, wow, there's a lot of hope in this room. I mean, it's palpable, you know, whatever your politics are. It was palpable. And two things went into my lint catcher. Thing one was that I was at JFK's inauguration, something I had kind of forgotten. And it came I was like, oh my gosh, I totally remember. So we used to live in Arlington when I was little, and my father worked at the Pentagon for Admiral Rickover, which is the job I gave to my character's husband. And so we got tickets to things, you know, a lot. And they weren't like tickets like it was, you know, Jackie and me or something, but it was like, you know, we got tickets to general kind of things. And we had tickets to the inauguration. We had seats and stuff outside. Now, I was like 4 years old. And so in a 4-year-old mind, president, whatever, I mean, you know, I didn't know anything about anything. And so what I remembered was how cold it was. I don't know if any of you remember, but it was really record-breaking cold that day. And it came on the heels of a giant blizzard, right? They almost canceled the inauguration. But what I remembered, and pardon me, but was that a kid sitting next to me, around my age, the snot froze on his face. And I was like, it was like being in a cave and seeing stalagmites or something. I was like, I didn't know that could happen. So I became completely mesmerized to the point where my father had to kind of shake my shoulders and say, there goes the next president. And then I looked up. So I have that like moment, you know. So as I'm watching this inauguration, I remembered that, you know, and I kind of chuckled to myself actually, but I remembered that. But I thought, oh my goodness, somehow the Kennedy inauguration is going to figure in this. Because if I have the earthquake, and that was such a time of despair, and also followed by World War I and the Spanish influenza. I mean, you just kept chalking up really horrible events. What a great bookend to have a time of such hope. So suddenly, this kind of novel became sort of a full-blown idea for me. And I knew I had a woman during Kennedy's time and a woman in 1919 post-earthquake. And then I thought, what have I just conceived? You know, I remembered my math teacher hanging over me saying, you are not doing your math homework, and you are doing terrible in math, and you are going to need math in your life. And me saying to her, no, I'm not. I'm going to be a writer. And suddenly I needed math because I'm like, wait, all right, I've got 1961, I've got 1919. How old is this person? What year was she born? And I have all these notes, and my math is really not great, so I'm like doing it over and over. But I ultimately decided it is possible that their lives can collide. That this woman who lived through the San Francisco earthquake can actually collide with my woman at Kennedy's inauguration. So I had my two female protagonists. The one at Kennedy's inauguration, her whole story is told in one day, that day. And I have to tell you, thank God for Google, because I had to check and be sure that it was as cold as I remembered and that it had snowed, because it became very important to the story that those two things had happened. And I was delighted that even at 4, it was cold enough to freeze snot on someone's face. I was delighted to know that. So my woman, Claire, 1961, is a suburban housewife living in, no surprise, Arlington, Virginia, where I lived as a child, married to someone who works in the Pentagon like my dad did. And she's 2 years away from Betty Friedan. So she is feeling things, but she has no outlet for those feelings. And her friends don't get it. They're perfectly happy. But she's a little ahead of her time, and she's feeling unsettled. She doesn't know if she's made the right choice in her life, and she's considering leaving her marriage. Unheard of. And even at the beginning of the book, in her first chapter, she talks about people who leave their children, because that's what would happen if she left that marriage. She would have to leave her child, too. So she's in a real mess. Vivien, my woman in 1919, is the obituary writer. And by writing these obituaries, she is able to explore her own grief over this lost lover. By bringing to life people who, loved ones that have been lost, she is able to kind of honor David, the man that she has lost. So this was my great delight. You know, every writer I know kind of sets out little challenges for themselves with each new book or each new project, and they are often not something that the reader would ever think of. And I always write from multiple points of view. And I always write contemporary fiction. Well, my first book took place in the 60s, so it was still contemporary, and I wrote it in the 80s. But I really wanted to try something in which the multiple points of view were not happening at the same time. And my challenge was, can I convincingly have them intersect? And in order to do that, because I became obsessed with the 1906 earthquake and Kennedy's inauguration, I really had a challenge, because so Vivien's story is always in 1919, kind of. And Claire's is always in 1961. So I really had to kind of plant a lot of clues and finagle a lot of stuff. Well, I can't say anything more. You have to read. Yeah, I don't know, because I just can't tell you. I worked really hard at it, though. Just take that and, appreciate that. Yeah. One thing I feel, and I'll get to the 1919 research in a second, but one of the things I feel is that even when I'm writing books that are contemporary, for example, the Knitting Circle, I read everything about knitting. I could never put it all in a novel. I couldn't put it in the encyclopedia of knitting. I read so much stuff. I used about, 5 or 10%. But I felt like I had this warehouse of information in which I could create a world that was authentic. And that's really all that we're trying to do, is create this world that you will believe. Somebody said, I was just at a literary conference in Tucson, and one of the writers, Larry Watson, and actually I disagreed with everything he said except this. He said, I have to get the little lies right so you'll believe the big ones. Because, in a way, in fiction, you're making everything up. So he's like, you need all the stuff of the time and the setting exactly right so they'll accept that a man in that time would do X, the bigger lie. So I would say this was kind of the same. The Knitting Circle, I read so many things about knitting, even a book, and I took notes on this as if I could somehow use it, Ukrainian mittens that they do for weddings, and they're these intricate patterns. And I found myself one day writing down one of the patterns and the ritual in which they give them, and I was like, okay, wait a minute. I'm writing a contemporary novel. Is anyone actually going to do this? Can I stop now? Has my research stopped? And I had to reach that point with this, too, because there is so much incredible stuff about the earthquake. And I kind of love that kind of reading, I've always been, Chris Van Allsburg, who wrote Polar Express, I interviewed him once for an article, and he talked about his obsession with capturing things right before they happen. So he's actually, an artist, and he does these sculptures of things right before a crisis. So someone running, he's frozen like this, and the building's about to go down, but everything is still safe. He likes to preserve the moment before. And so I kind of got into that thinking with the earthquake stuff because you could get a lot of even films of people the day before the earthquake walking down Market Street, shopping. And I became obsessed with that idea of what that was like before, almost more than the after. And I found all these great details that I did use, like the night before the earthquake, Caruso performed. And so I had my couple go to hear him and talk about the Caruso. So I did find things that I never would have known. But then at a certain point, you're making it up. So you get enough to shape a world. But what's more important is the interior life of the characters, and that kind of takes over, I think. I remember, in my girlhood dreams of wanting to be a writer, I thought, a writer has to have adventures, like Hemingway, like you run with the bulls. You must go do that, things like that, And that was one of the reasons that after college I went to work as a flight attendant. I thought I needed to acquire adventures. I had a pretty ordinary life. But I very quickly learned that what writers actually do is more what Eudora Welty said, which is all you have to do is sit on your own front porch. So much of writing is interior, not what the external world offers. So you're struggling always, I think, with that balance, and research is the perfect way to sort of describe that, because you're creating an external world, but ultimately, if your characters don't speak to the reader, all your research is for naught, right? Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming on. Thank you, Susan.